Otto, welcome. I'm very happy to have this conversation with you today. And I remember still vividly our lunch that I think it was 2 years ago in Cambridge. And I walked away with a very inspired and full of ideas, with a very inspired heart. And um, and so I would love to continue our conversation today about social transformation and collective trauma and how they might be interrelated and where the friction points and why social transformation maybe sometimes doesn't happen. And what's your take on it, since you spend a lot of time exploring those areas as well. So welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I walked away with exactly the same feeling from our lunch conversation. Can't believe it's already 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Now we are here, and I'm happy that we can continue the conversation and maybe also find ways of collaborate more intentionally together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I'm very happy about this too. So maybe I will say a few things that are on my mind right now, and then and would like to hear your take on it. So when I look at the transformation of human beings and systems that human beings create, I see in those systems, it's much more complex, but to simplify it, three forces. One is the drive to evolve, is the drive in me that anyway wants to develop. Then there's the drive of the habit, that we create habitual structures within ourselves and in the institutions and systems that we create that need some activation energy or some pressure or some stress to change. And then so the third part is, I believe, trauma, because trauma is kind of frozen life. And trauma is life that is scared, often scared to move. And when it gets pushed, it actually creates exactly the opposite. It creates a kind of a contraction and a holding. So from voluntary development, which I believe is the highest form, like also you teach in the Theorie U, that I can connect to the part in me that knows in a deeper place where I want to go, what's my purpose, what's the system's purpose. Perfect. So then often that bumps against the habit and sometimes also against the trauma. And I would like, first, maybe let's start with these three elements, how you relate to them, how you look at that. And then I will come a bit deeper into the collective dimension of trauma.
Very good. So I'm very happy that I'm finally learning something about trauma, because it's important. But as I mentioned to you earlier, so I'm not really, I don't think I have kind of a sufficient deep knowing or competence about it. So can I just, for my own understanding, I'm not sure I totally got the distinction between habit and trauma. So if in terms of the symptoms, so what exactly the how do you know whether it's one or the other? Because habit, in a way, it's also a certain stuckness, right, in patterns of the past. It's not frozen off, but so how do you know? But it's, in a way, it's not. In a way, it's also frozen in an old form. So how do you know it's one or the other?
Right. So let's start with the trauma. So trauma, basically, which I believe is a very intelligent function in itself. So when somebody goes through an overwhelming experience, then, and it's too overloading, it's like a ship that has a hole, and then water comes in. And then you seal off inside, you seal off the part of the ship so that not the whole ship's gonna drown. Mm. In an overwhelming situation that overloads the nervous system, we have two different elements. One is a hyperactivation. There's a lot of stress, and then the nervous system shuts down the noise, and it's frozen, quiet, so that the rest of the organism can simply still function to a certain extent, except the kind of impact is so strong that that's not doable. But so there's a frozen and then hyperactivated area that from that point on, if not treated, is going with that person as a numb area in the nervous system that is coated in a hyperactivation, and around this we build some kind of compensatory structures in the nervous system to protect it. So there's some kind of protection or defense mechanism around it. And so I believe when somebody or the society hits that part, so there's always a kind of a defense and a resistance coming up. Whereas in the habit is also kind of habitual connections that it's, I don't know, also in marriages, so often the partners become habits of each other. But with enough activation energy, that can be easier released into new movement. But the trauma is way more kind of delicate and fragile and hurt. So I think the trauma needs another treatment, like another holding, in order to restore the natural openness and flow in the nervous system. And the thing is that I believe trauma is something that the nervous system developed over most probably hundreds of thousands of years as a protection mechanism in order to survive better. And but the effects untreated create trouble in our lives. And so, and I somehow got, by working with large groups of people, I saw, or especially also on something like the Holocaust past, or this the Second World War past, or different other dictatorships in the world. So how the trauma of one person is connected to the trauma of many other people, and how that's kind of passed on to the following generations. And so I'm very interested how you relate to that, and also maybe what you see in social transformation really works and what doesn't work so well, so that systems really change. And maybe we can look at that process of what's not working well and illuminate that a bit together. That's my question.
That's very good. So just to clarify my understanding and to mirror back, so how would you, so there's trauma, you mentioned trauma of individuals, but then there's also collective trauma, right? And so there is, so how would you see then history? So what we of course often see is that collective trauma, if not addressed, can be used, is often kind of underneath kind of new violence, right? It gets activated in a way that is resulting into violence. So do you see world history as like, or kind of, is violence in history like a function of trauma not addressed?
That's right. That I would say the same thing, right? And that the trauma, like for example, let's take the after-war society in Germany, and then whatever 50 or 70 years later, war refugees from Syria come to Germany, and then there is a strong unconscious response that I believe shows certain symptoms. And as you said, if the same thing could also be much more violent, but that this kind of trauma cycles, they come up in it just takes decades sometimes in order for it to surface again. Where I think that's actually an attempt of the collective nervous system to detox something, but it ends up often in new catastrophes because we are not yet skilled enough, I believe, to read those signs as collective trauma signs, like same as you would look at an individual, like one client, and you see the hyper reaction of a client, you say, okay, you hit the trauma, so the person reacts that way. But in societies, I believe it's exactly as you say, it can, and that's also how trauma kind of recreates itself all the time, exactly the way you mentioned it. Right.
So, I would say, I think kind of my experience boils actually down to something very simple. And so I am, when you look at me and also, other people here, like my colleague Peter Senge or he is at MIT. So so what are we doing? It's basically developing awareness-based social technologies, right? So that's what I'm really trying to do. but it's also like framing a line of work, because social technologies, so people they don't know what it is, but so it sounds like something useful, right?
Mhm.
In reality, as we know from all advanced capacity building, the tools and the methods are overrated, right? So are vastly overrated, in fact, because they are the tangible part of a work that also has an intangible part. So methods and tools, when you look at all advanced capacity building, is maybe, I don't know, 20, 25, maybe 30% at most, right? But the other 2/3 or the other like 70% or something is the invisible part. That is kind of much more related, not to the tool itself, not to the tool, but to the development of the self of the user, right? To the development of my interior condition. So that's one aspect, kind of my inner condition. And the other aspect is the holding space. The holding space, that the container that I'm able to form for a social situation. So I think that's the invisible part, right, in this work that is usually underrated in a very significant way. And I remember I was the other day kind of sitting in China, kind of with Alibaba, kind of a technology company.
Mhm.
They had so it was a review session, right? So 8 different teams, and they all said they had used Theory U to advance certain processes and so on. And then I asked them to report on their experiences, right? So, and then kind of I remember the first group vividly, but the other ones were in part similar. So she said, yeah. So and then I, used this tool and that tool and so on. And then the feedback she got from her co-workers was, why are you doing this onto me? So that there was a resistance, kind of she applying the tools onto them, right? In her view, it was like deep listening and so on, something useful, she thought, right? But the feedback she got was, why are you doing this on me, right? So why are you applying? And so that type of feedback is a clear example that, yes, you maybe have like the tangible 20%, but what's missing is the other 80%, kind of the container building and the inner conditions. So creating this holding space. And I would assume that the more you move from, so the 3 forces that you talked about, my own kind of evolutionary aspirational force, and then the habitual patterns, and then trauma, the more you move from the former to the latter, the more important the container building. Because in trauma, kind of, it's all about kind of creating that safe holding space that allows this part of yourself that froze off, right? That you have disconnected from, in order to open that up. And I would assume that it's impossible to do that on your own. Kind of, you need kind of the collective listening as an enabling conditions, and in a way, kind of. So, what is Theory U? In a way, it's all about accessing kind of the deeper healing and the transformative qualities of our own listening. If we really connect to the deeper levels of our own being and to the deeper levels of what is wanting to emerge in a situation. So in that regard, I assume, even though I don't have really much professional experience, I would assume that there is a deep connection also of the work you are doing and the work we are doing.
Right.
And, I could talk more about that, but so my assumption is it's all about listening. It's all about the holding space. And it's about kind of creating like a container in a way that is that is appropriate to the situation and that allows kind of those wounds that have been inflicted in the past somehow to be attended in a different way and then also to be released.
That's right. I find it beautiful because that's exactly also how I look at this, that the deep listening and the sense of presence that you are able to provide in order to allow a group to probe deeper into these wounds. I think that's exactly, these are the main ingredients in how I envision also the kind of reverse of it, like what is the integration process of collective trauma, and how can we prevent actually the kind of this re-eruptions of this collective unconscious material. How can we take care of it before it needs to erupt again? And I think also that that's where our works really meet, in this deep presence that's needed, a deep listening, a deep attunement, and the capacity of people really to provide such a space. And I'm very happy for you to say that that the tools, you know, have a certain range of importance, but the inner development of facilitators, the inner development of people in systems, that's actually where the real transformation happens. And I see it completely the same. And I'm wondering how much when we are looking at, because in the Theory U, you go deep into that space that is the natural sort. I compare this often to the river. So there's in all of us like a river flowing anyway. And if I have space to get wet in the river, so I touch my own kind of essence. And then I will, from there, whatever all my creativity or my participation in creativity starts to come up naturally. And often I often compare the trauma as like when you swim in the river and then suddenly there's an iced over part of the river. So you get out of the water and you walk on the ice. And so when snowflakes fall into water, they become water. But when snowflakes fall onto ice, they pile up and there's a lot of snow on the ice. So trauma always doesn't allow us to really be responsible, like being able to respond to life. From there, we mostly react to life. And then if we have follow-up stuff, and so the layer becomes thicker and thicker instead of less and less. But in water, the snowflakes fall into the water and continue melt in the water. And I think that's a nice metaphor for how society or systems might respond also to change or to follow-up experiences or simply to the flow of life, like stuff that happens in our life that we either can digest and respond to, or we cannot digest it even because it starts to pile up and then there's more stress in the system, more stress and tension, and then all kinds of other symptoms that escalate in a way. And I'm wondering, when you look at social transformation, if the traces also of those frozen layers in society, because I think also even in post-war Germany, but I take this just as an example, it can be slavery and racism now in the US or former apartheid in South Africa, that how it's being passed on to the next generations and that the next generations express symptoms. I mean, it's clearly to see that everybody here, for example, in Israel knows that the second and third generation Holocaust survivor families, the children, how they express certain symptoms that are kind of known in the society as symptoms, like trauma symptoms. And I'm wondering when we
what's an example for that?
Yeah, that for example, own needs of the children often are being repressed or suppressed in order not to bother the parents that are anyway heavily hurt. So it's like people started like to walk on eggs in a way and not try to disturb, but then their own development of needs and their own development of what I want and need in life is kind of held back. Or that some people, when people grow up in traumatized family systems, one way, I'm saying because it's very complex, but one way is that people feel like in cotton. Because if the emotional system of the parents is shut down because of the hurt, So when the child reaches out, it's kind of, you touch cotton, you touch a kind of an untangible area. And then children grow up as if they are kind of a bit like astronauts in their own body. So the embodiment needs a lot of body contact in the first years, needs a lot of emotional warmth. And if that's maybe just if people are physically present but emotionally not available, children often grow up in this kind of airy space. And then it feels harder for them to ground themselves and be very concrete in life. So this is just one symptom, but I think that there are some that we see more often, how those symptoms move over generations. And and I'm wondering, we are sitting in this kind of fragmented world already thousands and thousands of years. And for us, it's a normal environment, whereas actually it's not normal, it's hurt. And we often, I think that the hurt becomes a societal structure after some time. And I'm wondering how much, if we are passionate about, like I know you are very much, and I am too, about social transformation and the evolution of our societies and systems, how much that actually inhibits it. Maybe where does it grow it? Maybe what is the trauma also where it induces growth or resilience? Yeah, so that's a little bit my.
So the question is where the trauma is inhibiting social transformation.
Right. And how do you see this in your labs? Maybe that certain elements that you introduce actually can't induce a movement, and where do they induce movement?
So I'm not sure whether I can really in a useful data-driven way answer the question in regard to collective trauma, but I at least have a number of experiences that at least kind of can give some hints. But let me first, I am kind of really intrigued by the way you described the some of the phenomena, kind of so being an astronaut in your own body, or kind of this numbness and kind of your the cotton experience, kind of that you're not can't fully connect somehow, which both of which I interpret a little bit like a disconnect between body and mind, right? So there's like kind of or a disconnect between your own self and your senses, right? Kind of really, because the senses are the gateway really of embodiment, right? So a question I'm just interested in is, okay, so we know like the senses of the individual, right? So it's like, is it 5, 7, or others say it's 10 or 12 or so, like different senses, but those are the gateways how we connect with reality, how we connect, and there's a lot of intelligence in that, and kind of so in us refining them. And I'm always interested in the question, okay, we know that, but what is the role of the senses for the collective, right? So for example, if you work with a community, if you work with an ecosystem, a lot of the organization issues today are ecosystem issues. So we have an ecosystem, but it's fragmented. Right. It doesn't have like a shared body. It doesn't have like enabling infrastructures that allow the system or the ecosystem to sense and see itself, which is to transcend the state of being an astronaut in your own body, right? So this being an astronaut in your own body and kind of this numbness and this kind of not connecting, so this cotton type of barrier disconnect experience that you described, that's in fact the condition of the collective that we have in many systems. Kind of, so that is that's why I thought it was really interesting, the phenomenology of what you described. And a question that came to my mind while listening to you is, okay, so where do we see that at scale today, right? And it's very clear where we see it, right? It's in technology, right? So it's kind of the digital disruption and the dark side of it. So that's kind of where, and I think if maybe in your community and the listeners to this, in case you use some of this material, there's a really great book that came out a few weeks ago, Shoshana Zuboff, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which really makes the point that so it's not like an anti-technology book. It's also not an anti-data book, but it talks about how over the past 15 years something happened, kind of that just like in the 20th century, kind of labor capital, socialism, capitalism. It's basically, from an economic point of view, it's kind of the division between labor and capital, setting the economic foundations for a lot of conflicts. And in this century, moving into surveillance capitalism, it is the distinction between watchers and watched. So the people that are being watched, from which our big data is being extracted from, and those entities or those companies kind of that, appropriate kind of this data, just like in the old capitalism, like that Karl Polanyi described. It was the appropriation of labor, of nature, right? So of the commodification, and then also of money, right? So it's so the question I have is the phenomenology of trauma, of collective trauma that you describe. Are we witnessing that on a planetary scale in the evolution towards a surveillance capitalism?
Sure.
And if yes, what does that mean? So what have we learned from working with collective trauma in other instances that could be applicable now also to this larger situation? And so what again, so coming back in a way, kind of, so the little experience that I have in that context, so I would always come back to container building and to something. So the more I think about that, the more I'm, so I'm trying to develop a notion there, which is the concept of multi-level container building. Because if I look at these situations we talked about Rwanda before, or also on a personal level, right? So when you deal with trauma, it is almost never the case that when you try to address that as a facilitator or as a helpful person there, that by bringing everyone together, you do something good. That's usually not the case, because you need to, because the container building conditions are so difficult. And in general, if you build the container in a smaller group, like a one-on-one conversation with the multiple parties involved, that's much more easy kind of to create kind of the initial kind of opening conditions. And then at a later stage, you bring together smaller subgroups, and then maybe even later kind of the larger system. So it's a kind of multi-level process to develop the container. And that's also, we talked earlier about ULab-S, kind of how we now kind of move from the old ULab more, the first part of the ULab, focusing on the individual, to a second part that is designed around helping teams to go through this journey. And again, when you really deconstruct the making of that, it's all about multi-level container building, right? So there's all these small local groups, and then there's their connection, and then there's a holding space for that. And I'm sure you're doing the same. So it's like when you really address complex situations, you always shape and co-shape multiple levels of holding spaces, of containers. And that's what, is at least half of the work that you do. And from there, that's basically the soil from which, if we are lucky, kind of something healing and helpful can grow.
Beautiful. Beautiful. No, I love it. I love it. I'm just looking, where should I start? Because you said so many things. I love, first of all, I love yes to the multi-layer or multi-level container building. That's also what we are doing, especially also in the collective trauma work, forming local pocket groups. They are being connected to bigger units and being connected to bigger units. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And like there's so many things. I was so inspired by what you said. So first of all, I agree. I actually had a TEDx talk in Marin about trauma and technology, and I absolutely think that we are at a very important time or moment where I think when we understand that the embodied part of us, and I believe even that the climate crisis is actually a disembodiment crisis. And it's a relational crisis. So trauma always hurts my embodiment, and it hurts, as you said, my senses. Where I'm traumatized, I cannot really perceive the world as it is around me. It will always appear distorted in me. And I don't know that because I assume that my perception is it. I see you. But that maybe some parts of you I don't see, I don't even know, because I assume that I see you, except I'm humble enough to say, okay, what I see is what I see, but this doesn't mean that that's what's out there. Out there might be much more. I can only say what I perceive. And so in my experience, trauma always hurts the embodiment and always fragments the physical, emotional, and mental self. And I believe one of the major trauma symptoms is that we can talk about interpretations that have nothing to do with the actual experience. So often when people say, okay, it's a difficult situation, and then it might be that many people say, yes, difficult, but what actually did the person say? I don't understand difficult. Does difficult mean that you were afraid, that you were ashamed, that you were numb and you couldn't feel anything, that you were highly stressed? It's kind of a layer on top of the real experience. And so I'm thinking one of the dangers is that in the rational time or scientific time, that the beauty of the rational development is sitting on the fracture of a traumatized self. And then is using it actually to cover it up instead of showing, wow, there's a wound I cannot feel. So there's like a canyon, a numb canyon, and on top of it, all kinds of rational interpretation bridges. And then when we walk there, we can communicate, but we actually don't talk about that empty space that we can't feel through our senses and bodies and emotions. And only in crisis moments, when those bridges start to crumble or fall apart, then we see the big gaps that are in our society. And I agree with you, the societal body is disembodied often and fragmented. And if that marries technology, I think it's going to end up in a disaster. Because if trauma and technology marry, we actually get the dark side of it. And dark literally like unconscious. It's dark meaning unconscious. It's not in our awareness. But if the conscious part of us partners up with technology, we have a blessing. But I think this is also kind of a citizenship responsibility. What do I invest in? And do I really examine and ask myself those questions? Because I contribute right now, while I'm talking to you, I'm contributing to the technological world in a way through the technology we are using right now, and everybody runs around with a mobile phone. And then the other part I think is also that like a mobile phone, my smartphone in a way initiates me into global citizenship. So now I have access basically almost anywhere to almost everything, like all the information that's out there. And then I'm wondering, because this gives me a massive learning opportunity. There's a lot of creativity in learning, but there are also many, many trauma impulses. You hear the terror attack that happened in Belgium. You hear 15 minutes after it happened, you have a push message on your phone. So this means that I am confronted, and I'm wondering about this process. Like I'm so informed, but when I read about the terror attack, somebody takes a truck and drives it into pedestrians. When I read this, can I, as a human being, still be a witness, and as you said before, a listener, and feel what that means? Most probably not. Most probably I will read this rationally, be numb inside, because I cannot comprehend emotionally and physically what that event really means. But so we are living in a time where we are super informed, it seems, but I'm wondering how many people can really allow this to be an embodied witnessing capacity, so that I really feel what it means. And so I think the danger is also that the more we are informed, we are bombarded through trauma impulses that are happening, because we have access to so much trauma information also, that we actually feel less and less, because we are often, numb ourselves in order to deal with the massive amount of information that comes to us. And so I see this also as another step of the same question that you bring up.
Yeah.
Like, isn't the information age actually increasing sometimes the numbing, and that we are becoming actually more and more indifferent to very important things that are happening in the world, because I care about it only when I feel it. And when I don't feel it, okay, yeah, it happened. But then am I still a witness? And how many people witness the tragedy really? Like that we say, wow, it really touches me in my vulnerability, and I'm a real listener. And so that's, I think, a very, very important question. Where do we go with technology nowadays? And I think it's a super important one for us to tracks. Yeah.
So what you described, kind of the image that came up for me, it's like if you translate what you describe into the shape of a human being, right? It's like kind of a head that is growing infinitely, right? And then the heart part is like very small, right? Very, very, out of proportion to what kind of the head is processing, right? And then I don't know about the legs and the arms, but so there's, I think that disconnect that you indicated with the numbness and with the being an astronaut. I mean, so the way I heard you saying being an astronaut in yourself is kind of your mind is separate from your embodied experience, right? So there is kind of something, and that in fact is kind of the big. It's also when you look at the ecological crisis, right? It's the knowing doing gap. We know everything that needs to happen. I mean, since the late 70s actually. So when you look at the green movement and stuff, there's some updates there, but so all of that is known, but it's not happening. It's not embodied. And the journey from kind of knowing everything but doing so little is going through the heart, right? So and in many ways, kind of, I think what our work is really beginning to approach is more kind of how to activate and cultivate the heart of the collective, right? And what are the different gateways into that, and the senses are very important, and the container building is very important, and doing that in multiple levels. It's also like personal cultivation, I think, kind of the role of the individual in a way. So I think that's that is definitely so that I believe has a lot of resonance, at least kind of from where I am. I also feel that technology today is really one of the biggest questions around, because it's mostly in our blind spot, right? Yet, just as in the 20th century, with so where did the environmental, the green movement start really? Well, some say Rachel Carson, the Silent Spring. That was really about the unintentional impact of technology on nature, right? On the outer nature. And what we see right now in the 21st century is the unintentional impact of technology on our inner nature, on our mind. And that's where we begin to see the data only to emerge now. the issue is well captured with kind of it has to do with amplifying the separation of the mind and the body. The separation itself is not new, but what is new is the huge amplification through technology that makes it much more urgent for us to pay attention to that and use technology, design, deploy, and use technology more with a different intention, right? With a different intention, which is really connecting to the essence of our humanity and not kind of becoming separate from that. So that's in many ways, I think, where I think both our works is focusing on, and where I'm really so happy and thankful to be in the collaboration. And hopefully, I mean, we know it is a beginning, so we'll continue that in just a few days, right? So when your team will be helping us to demo something in the ULab S, which is one of our approaches to bring these methods of embodied change, kind of that allows us to really not only think about the suffering of myself and others, but kind of sense into that in a much more embodied way, in a much more collective way, to use that methodology more at scale.
No, that's fantastic. Yeah. First of all, I appreciate this collaboration as well, and the growing collaboration. And as you said, there's one more thing, and just a few sentences to the container building. What I found is very strong, and it's a mixture of generating presence through some contemplative practice that I do, but also that the nervous system actually has a very refined capacity to be attuned to another human being. So in the trauma work, what we learn is to use our own nervous system and clear it. Because if I'm very traumatized, I can't do it because my nervous system is also kind of shut down in certain places. But if I open this, so then, and I meet another person, so container building is also attunement, is feeling the other person and presencing, listening. And so what I found out is actually that, when we work with attachment trauma or early trauma, so every trauma is kind of stored in the nervous system at a certain level of development. It's kind of like a time-space coordinate system where we can track the trauma that's stored somewhere. And then I started to apply this on a bigger scale on the collective trauma work, that actually the same is also true when you sit with a larger group of people, let's say a few hundreds of people, that the trauma layers, they are still stored somewhere in the collective, in the collective body or the systems body. And I find it interesting, like when we train those capacities, like when we start with individuals and then expand it, how we can literally use our own nervous system in a precise way to offer another person or offer a system like a co-regulation function, because a lot of trauma has been inflicted through inappropriate relation. So relation or appropriate relation is actually the remedy. And so when the more people, as you also do it, in the precise listening and presencing and relating, there is an element, there's a remedy that is super important. That sounds very simple, but professionalized. Like every parent, when you hold a baby, your nervous system naturally attunes to the rhythm and the interior of the baby. And when you attune to another human being, the nervous system does the same thing, like it's built in parenting. And I think that's an amazing function to create container building for listening. So I find this a very interesting capacity that we have, that is built in, that utilizes basically all that you said before, with the presencing, the listening, the feeling, the sensing. Yeah.
That's a wonderful summary. I'm sorry, I have to jump off now to another thing I'm already late for, but I think that's a beautiful summary, and what you because it really makes it so much more practical what I described here before. And it also really, so it's really illuminating for me listening to that, because it relates to some of my own experiences, and it totally resonates. Yeah, so that's a very good way of grounding what we talked about earlier in this attunement that you described.